Hello and welcome to the UNB Law Podcast. My name is Michael Marin and I'm the Dean of Law at UNB. We begin all of our events by recognizing and respectfully acknowledging that the UNB Law community gathers on the unsurrendered and unceded traditional lands of Wolastoqiyik. Today I have the pleasure of sitting down with Ian Putnam, a graduate of the UNB Law class of 1996. Before enrolling at UNB Law, Mr. Putnam earned a BA with honors in politics from Queen's University and an MSc in government from the London School of Economics. Mr. Putnam started his legal career at the Toronto office of Stikeman Elliott. In 2000, he moved to New York City to join Paul Weiss, one of the top business law firms in the United States. After nearly 5 years at Paul Weiss, he returned to Canada to become a partner at Stikeman Elliott. During his career in private practice, Mr. Putnam was involved in major M&A and corporate finance transactions with particular focus on the retail, real estate, and consumer product sectors. In 2014, he became Executive Vice President, Chief Corporate Development Officer of the Hudson's Bay Company. Until last year, he was President, Real Estate, and Chief Corporate Development Officer of HBC. His current role is CEO of Hbc Properties and Investments, which manages 40 million square feet of leasable space in North America. Ian, thank you so much for joining us on the UNB Law Podcast. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today.
So delighted to be here. I'm very excited to participate.
That's great. So why don't we start with your life before law school? Can you tell us a little bit about your upbringing?
So it's a long time ago now, but I'm not sure I had a life before law school, but let's pretend I did. So I was born in Sarnia, Ontario, in 1970. My family shortly thereafter moved to Toronto, where I spent the next 13 years in the Toronto suburb of Scarborough, and then moved from Scarborough to Calgary. My father worked in the oil and gas business, and that was obviously, or still is, the epicenter of oil and gas in Canada. And we moved to Calgary. So spent my junior high school and high school years in Calgary, and then from there went to Queen's, and then to the London School of Economics, and then ended up at UNB.
Wow, that's really interesting. So you got to see a fair bit of Canada growing up. Now I noticed you studied politics at Queen's. What appealed to you about that area of study?
So I think, like most parents, my parents probably wanted me to be a doctor, but I had no interest in the sight of blood. So ended up focusing more on social sciences, and have always had an interest in politics and in government. And so I took the opportunity to study politics both at Queen's and in London, before obviously going to law school.
So you mentioned LSE, which is one of the world's great institutions of higher learning. Can you tell us a little bit about what it was like to study at LSE at the time?
So it was 1992, 1993, and it was fantastic. I'm a big fan of being in the middle of the action. So I'm a big fan of big cities like New York and London and Toronto and Fredericton. So the experience at LSE was, I look at it from two perspectives. One, being in London, which again I think is one of the greatest cities in the world, and having the opportunity to be in London as a young person was fantastic. The community in which I lived comprised people from all over the world. So there were a lot of Canadians where I lived, but also Americans, obviously Brits, but also people from Northern Europe and Eastern Europe and South America. And so it was a great experience personally, through, because I met a lot of great people, many of whom I keep in touch with, it's hard after such a long period of time and people being so dispersed around the world, but made great friends, enjoyed being in London, and we took advantage of everything that London had to offer at the time. So, for example, in London, obviously London's a theater mecca. They had student days, which were Wednesday productions were typically made available to students. You could buy tickets the day of for £15. So you could see all these fabulous West End productions. You could get involved in the theater community and take advantage what London had to offer, even on a budget. So the personal, exploring the world aspect of London. The other thing is actually London is so close to everywhere else in Europe, and flights are so cheap on these, discount air carriers. You can go to wonderful places, to Rome, to Venice, to all these places for the weekend, again, relatively inexpensively, certainly at the time. So I took full advantage of that. That's sort of the personal experience side of things. The academic side of things, it was also fantastic. My subject matter was the politics and government of Western Europe. At the time, the Maastricht Treaty was being hotly debated in the United Kingdom, and it was sort of the focus. And they had, LSE was sort of a player in those conversations through the academics that were there, and it was a forum. And I remember Jacques Delors, who was the chairman of the European Commission at the time, came to the London School of Economics and spoke, and I sat in the front row. And it was, to be in that environment at that time, learning about that subject matter was fantastic. I loved every minute about my time in London. It was only a year-long program, or 12 months, and I took full advantage of being there, both again, personally, socially, and academically.
I mean, that sounds amazing. And I when I'm speaking to students, if they ask me about what to do before law school, I often talk to them about these kinds of experiences, traveling, working, studying in a different country for a period of time. It just gives you so much more perspective and insight. I imagine you learn a lot about yourself as well, living on your own and adjusting to different attitudes and a different environment and meeting people who might think differently than you. So, all of that is part of one's personal development. That sounds like an amazing opportunity.
Absolutely. And we may get there, but I always sort of, not always, but sort of from 10th grade, 11th grade onward, I sort of thought about a career in law. But I wasn't ready at that point in time. And so that extra year to sort of explore and in somewhat of a structured way, explore the world, or at least Europe, it was a huge benefit to my academic development, if you will. And I think I was more prepared for law school having done that than I would have otherwise been.
Well, so let's talk about that. So you said that you had been thinking about law school for quite some time. What was it that appealed to you about studying law?
So it's going to sound cavalier or goofy, but do you remember the TV show? You're younger than me. Do you remember the TV show LA Law?
Yeah, sure.
So I loved that television show. I think it came out in 1986, which would have been, I was 16 in 1986. Thought it was the best show ever. I loved, there was a character, Douglas Brackman Jr., who was the sort of a corporate guy at the firm. Yeah. And I just thought, again, it was fictitious and it was television law, but I sort of thought, well, that's kind of a neat thing. I like to be in the center of things, as I mentioned. A little later, a book called, maybe it was in 1986, a book called Barbarians at the Gate came out, which was about the leveraged buyout of RJR and Nabisco. I read that at 16 or 17 or 18, whenever it was, and was compelled by the characters and by the sort of the drama in the boardroom and the sort of the structuring of these transactions and how it worked. So that sort of gave me the idea of going to law school. I never had a focus on the courtroom or on litigation. It was more on the business law side of things. And that's probably in part because my father was in business and we talked about it at home. But my focus was always on sort of a corporate side of things. But through those kinds of books, that genre of book where it was sort of real life descriptions of events and television, that I sort of had an interest in corporate law.
That's really, really interesting. And very often it's popular culture, media, that kind of thing that will introduce someone to a particular field, and it resonates with their personality and their experiences. So I don't think that's goofy at all. I think that's absolutely.
Until LA Law came out, I always wanted to be a fireman because of the show Emergency, which would predate you for sure. But that was my favorite show from 7 to 16. So
okay, well, see, Ian, I wanted to be a doctor because of Doogie Howser, MD.
There you go. There you go.
So
you're right. It's amazing how popular culture and events can sort of form one's career path.
Absolutely. Well, that's really interesting. And then why did you choose UNB Law?
So in London, I lived in a place called London House, which had a lot of Canadians that lived there. And one of my friends at London House was doing an LLM at the London School of Economics, and he had graduated from UNB.
Okay.
His name was Gary Scales,
Yeah.
and he the way he described UNB, it really, as a small school focused at that point on sort of practical education, small class sizes, it appealed to me. And I had family in Fredericton at the time, and it was obviously a big shift going from London to Fredericton. But to be honest, as wonderful as London was, I would not want to be an undergraduate student in a big metropolitan area like London or Toronto or even Calgary or any big city. I think there's too many distractions. So for me, the idea of for undergraduate or for law school, where that you need to focus, I think the idea of being in a smaller community was very appealing to me at the time, and that's how I ended up at UNB.
And so what was your first day of law school like? Do you remember that? It's one of these questions that I ask because many of us can remember the first day of law school. Can you?
I certainly can. I remember pulling into the parking lot in front of Ludlow Hall. I remember, frankly, what I was wearing, and I remember my first time walking into the Ludlow Hall and down the stairs and looking at those pictures of the graduating classes over the years on the wall, and thinking, I remember being pretty excited about that, and sort of it was the first day of the next step in my life. So it's obviously a 3-year commitment, and it was nice to know that this was where I was going to be for the next 3 years, and it was pretty exciting.
So one of the things that I like to ask our guests, because we have alumni from different periods in the law school's history, is what I want to know what the law school was like when you were there. And so, how would you describe the law school in the early to mid 90s?
So I describe it as akin to junior high school. So in a good way. Again, part of the appeal to me of UNB was the size. At the time, there were probably 220, 240 students max, 80 kids in each year. Everybody knew everybody, right? So as a first year law student, I was hanging out with second and third years, and it was a very social environment, but people were obviously very focused on their academics, maybe less so in first year for the first couple of weeks. But I found it to be a very intimate environment. We were divided into two sections in first year. So you hung out with your section, which were 40 kids or 38 kids or whatever the number was, and you obviously had classes with that group for the year. And I thought it was a fabulous way to integrate into the law school community. And so socially and from the sort of engagement in the school perspective, I think the way it was structured was very beneficial to me. From an academic perspective, I thought the faculty, and this was one of the things that Gary Scales had talked to me about, was the high quality of the faculty and the focus on sort of the practicalities of law. So in first year, had Carl Dorr for contracts, who we talked about peppercorns for, weeks, it seemed, as consideration. It was just a David Thompson. We talked about the law of gifts, which was, it was interesting. You never thought about things like that. But it gave you a basis to think. And I thought that the faculty and the way they taught the Socratic method in some cases, more conversational than others. I thought it was a great environment in which to be taught the law and in which to learn the law, and how to think as a lawyer. And it certainly suited me very well in my 3 years there.
It's so interesting because we hear many of the same themes from our alumni, and one of the things that I'm keen to remind our alumni of is that DNA is still part of UNB Law. And so when you look at the structure of our curriculum, it remains focused on core principles and basic skills. The structure of our classes in two sections, trying to keep the class sizes small is still basically how we're structured, although we have a few more students. Our enrollment now is around high 260s, low 270s, so not a lot bigger than when you were here. But if you came by the law school and sat in on a day of lectures, I think that you would you would recall a lot of the same sorts of sort of themes and practices in terms of our curriculum. So it's definitely part of our sort of core brand as a law school. It focuses on fundamental principles and skills. The idea being that then you're prepared for any area of practice. So we've kind of shied away from the hyper specialization that we see in other law schools. Other law schools over the last 10, 20 years have developed specialized programs in particular areas. And we very consciously decided to keep our program a generalist one, because we want to make sure that we offer a timeless education that prepares our students not just for what is required the day after graduation, but 10, 20, 30 years after. I want to ask you something about this though, because sometimes our students, when they are going through our program, they find it a little bit too structured. So we make them take courses like conflicts, and evidence and commercial law and business organizations and all of this. And they sometimes say to us, why do I have to take all these courses? I'm not interested in that stuff. I want to be able to take whatever I want. And what's your perspective on that?
Well, you don't know what you don't know until you learn about it. So, again, I think that's one of the school's many strengths in that, if you provide too much choice, then people are overwhelmed and tend to focus on things that, they think they're interested in, without having the exposure to things that they may be interested in, but they just don't know it. So I think it's a wonderful part of the program at UNB. And there are courses that I took that I thought, I'm taking this under duress, but it ended up learning a lot more than I thought, and enjoying it much more than I thought. And when I articled, at Stikeman, you had to do a rotation in corporate, and you had to do a rotation in litigation. And as I mentioned, my focus at the time was corporate law, but I really enjoyed my litigation rotation. And after it, I debated: do I want to come back as a litigator, or do I want to come back in corporate? It's a little different, but you don't know what you don't know. So being exposed to things that I think are core to being a lawyer, right? You have to understand what a tort is. You have to understand conflicts to be a really good lawyer, because it comes up even in the background. But you have to have some basis of understanding in all of those areas. So I think it's a really valuable way to organize your program.
That's great to hear. Yeah, and it's a principle that we're committed to and have been for decades. I'm wondering, on a lighter note, if there are any sort of anecdotes or kind of fond memories that you have, even after some time away from law school, that you remember, that you talk to your classmates about. Hey, you remember that time this happened? Or do you have any of those memories?
So one memory so first of all, there's umpteen very positive memories of being in class, of engaging socially, of going to I can't remember any of the names of the pubs or the bars, but oddly, many of my classmates were musical, and they would perform at some of the local pubs, and that was always fun. There were one of my favorite takeaways was there were a few kids in my class that were from Ontario. We were referred to as the Upper Canadians, which I always thought was charming.
I'm from, and they call me an Upper Canadian.
Right, exactly. You're a Lower Canadian. So I was an Upper Canadian, but there were a group of us, and I'm doing it today on purpose, that wore a lot of sweaters for some reason. And we were deemed or called the Sweater Boys by Pam Williams, who I think is practicing in PEI now. But she coined the phrase "the Sweater Boys," and I think it stuck with me for a long, long time. So that was one of my takeaways.
It's true.
I'm not sure it's good or bad, but I wear it as a badge of honor.
Oh, so. I'm sure it was in the most affectionate way, like Mr. Rogers, that kind of
exactly. But it took on a life of its own. So I'm sure I'll forever be known as the Sweater Boy.
Well, that's great. So let's talk a little bit about what happened after law school. So you mentioned you went to Stikeman in Toronto, and you talked about how even as a kid you were kind of influenced by your father, by popular culture. You're sort of intrigued by corporate law. So is that why you decided to go to Bay Street? That was kind of your opportunity to make that move after graduation?
Yeah, so I think I think the classes that I took. I took all of the sort of the corporate focused classes available at UNB in the second and third year. I took the corporate finance class with Dick Bird, who was a wonderful professor. Tax 2, which was the business tax course, all taught by Dick Bird. And I just loved the subject matter. Back to the Barbarians at the Gate book. One of the cases we studied for a few days in corporate finance was Metropolitan Life versus RJR Nabisco, which was a seminal case in the Southern District of New York that talked about bond indentures and the rights of the different constituents in an insolvency proceeding. I just thought that was fascinating, and I really found it interesting, and that sort of focus of work appealed to me. So, even back at the LA Law times, I saw myself as a native Torontonian going back to Toronto and going to Bay Street if I could. And Stikeman at the time recruited on campus at UNB, as did another handful of firms at the time. We were, I think, fairly novel. Of my class of 80, I would say 7 or 8, maybe 10 max went to Toronto to different firms. And Stikeman appealed to me because it had a connection to UNB. So Lawson Hunter, who is a senior counsel at Stikeman, was a UNB grad, and he came back and gave a talk at UNB. I had already, I think, accepted my articling position at UNB at Stikeman at the time, but I had spent some time with Lawson. He sort of split his time between the Toronto office and the Ottawa office, but ran the competition bureau at one point, but also ran the competition group at Stikeman. So I remember talking with him, and so Stikeman was the right fit for me at the time, and I loved my time there. Just back to Lawson. When he came back and gave a speech at UNB, I had the opportunity to thank him, and I think it was in my second year at the time. And he talked about specialization in the practice of law. So, he had a graphic that went from left to right as being generalist to being a specific, a specialist. And I joked at the end that after my first year property law class, I exclusively wanted to focus on the law of gifts. And I found that so fascinating that you have to have both the intention to give and the delivery. And so I made some crack, but his point of view was, I think, what you articulated, which is at that stage in our legal education, focus on the general and can specialize over time. Anyways, that's an aside, but Lawson and the history that Stikeman had with UNB was attractive to me, and the people that I engaged with at Stikeman, it was a great place to be.
So you stayed there for a little while, but then you eventually went to Paul Weiss in New York, and students often ask me about what it's like to practice law in New York City, and there's sort of a mythology around it. So why don't you tell us what it was like working there for you?
So I loved it. I had a fabulous 5 years at Paul Weiss. I started the day after Y2K, or the Monday after Y2K. Everything, I got there safely. Nothing, planes didn't crash, and it was. So when I started, it was before the tech bubble burst, and it was busy, crazy busy. But I loved every minute of it. I loved being in New York. Again, I'm a big city person. I loved being in the center of what I thought was the action. I loved working on transactions, global transactions that you'd read about in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or the Globe and Mail. I did a lot of traveling to Europe and to Asia. And to Canada at my time at Paul Weiss. And my experience might have been a little different than many. I didn't find it to be, I'm not sure what the right word is, but I didn't find it to be a grind. I enjoyed most of my time. I enjoyed all of my time at Paul Weiss, and I enjoyed most of my time, even if I was working late, even if I was, working long weeks or long hours. I just like to be part of the action. And back to the London comment, New York is also a center where people aggregate. right? So I was from Toronto. There were my colleagues were from all over the United States and all over the world. So to have the opportunity to work with people from Dallas or people from California or people from France, it was great, and I really enjoyed my time there. I enjoyed working on the large, sophisticated transactions, even as a junior lawyer. I enjoyed the travel and I just and I obviously loved being in New York at the time.
So let's talk a little bit about your practice. So you focused on corporate finance and M&A, and how would you describe that kind of work to a law student? Like, what is special about it, fun about it, interesting about it? Like what's your pitch for that area of practice? Because it's often foreign to law students, in first, second year, especially if they don't have a business background or, didn't read Barbarians at the Gate or watch LA Law, right? So what is special to you about this area of practice?
So read Barbarians at the Gate would be my advice. And if it's of interest to you, the goings on, then explore a career in corporate law. So, and again, there's different gradations of engagement in corporate law. So my Stikeman and Paul Weiss experience, they were big, complicated transactions, big deal teams, lots of sophisticated bankers and advisors involved in these transactions. But that was very appealing to me. And again, I say my experience might have been a little different than others at big New York law firms. And that's because my mentor, a guy named Ted Maynard, led what Paul Weiss called the Canadian practice. And he was a perfect role model, both professionally, very, very smart and engaged, but also had a balance. And at the time, people weren't talking about work-life balance as much as they certainly are today. But Ted was. And so I think that made my experience that much better, because he was a guy that would bring you to a meeting or include you on conference calls, and would explain to the client that, oh, Ian's here just to learn, right? So we're not going to, so I think my experience was a very good one. So I think that's an important part of one's experience in corporate law, which is, who are you working with and what are you working on? So that's one thing. But I think if you're someone that's interested in complicated corporate transactions, then I think corporate law is a great career path. And I think it takes some time. There is some drudgery. I mean, being a first year associate locked in a room doing due diligence is not the most glamorous thing in the world, but it's you learn more than you ever thought you'd learn about a Greek television company when you do that in connection with a bond offering. Maybe that's not useful information. You got to make the best of the circumstance. So being a young lawyer in a big firm, there's a certain amount of drudgery, but again, depending upon who you're working with, try to get involved and try to engage in the higher end type of work if you can, and I think it's a great way to learn and to build a career.
I really like what you said about your mentor, because mentorship is so important in developing our professional identity, our practice, learning the substance of our fields. And that is often just as important as what firm you go to, or what city you go to. It's you really have to find good people to work with. And I had a similar experience to you. I was fortunate to land with someone who was an excellent mentor, who protected me a little bit, who gave me good work, and that makes all the difference. And I think that's relevant wherever our graduates choose to go, whether it's a big firm or small firm or government or whatever. Mentorship is really important.
So I'm a big believer in relationships, and I've built my career on relationships. And I can sort of identify 5 relationships in my life that were pivotal and got me to where I am. And um, and that's so important. And if it weren't for those 5 people and meeting them at the right time, and my life would be very much different today, and my career path would have been very different today. And some of that's luck, some of it's inserting yourself and identifying who you want to mentor you along the way. And you got to be proactive. And so arriving at Paul Weiss, for example, and meeting Ted, my objective was to work more and more with Ted as to the extent that I could. And that relationship with with 4 or 5 other relationships were critical to my professional success, certainly.
Wow. So for our students watching this, there's some really important lessons in what Ian just said. So you stayed at Paul Weiss for, was it 5 years?
5 years.
5 years, and then you came back to Stikeman. So why did you want to come back to Canada at the time?
So I had met my wife at Paul Weiss, and she was from Washington, D.C., or a suburb of Washington, D.C. I was obviously from Toronto. We, at the time, didn't want to raise a family in New York. And so we debated Washington, D.C. or Toronto as a place to go and to raise a family. So New York, again, New York is a draw for a lot of young people, but the Paul Weiss first year class would be like 100 people. It's absurd. It's huge. And by the time 8 years rolls around, there's 3 people left of that 100. So we decided, and because people go back to home in San Francisco or Omaha or wherever they go to after having spent some time in New York. So we decided to move to Toronto because I had a history with Stikeman. My focus was, again, corporate commercial. My wife's also a lawyer, obviously, and her focus was litigation, corporate litigation. So we went back to Toronto. So I rejoined Stikeman. She joined Osler. And we moved to Toronto to sort of start that part of our career and to have a family and to raise that family in still obviously a big city, but a city that was more manageable from a lifestyle perspective than New York.
Yeah, absolutely. Makes very good sense. And then you went to HBC, so you became executive VP there. And now, lawyers often leave firms to become in-house counsel, but you made the jump right to being a business executive. And that kind of stood out to me as sort of an interesting or a unique kind of shift on your part. What was that transition like for you from, going from the advisor to being sort of in the boardroom making the business decisions?
So it was seamless, and I'll tell you why. It's because of the legal education that I had and what I was doing as a practicing lawyer. But just back to, because you made the point about the importance of relationships. Yeah. So I mentioned Ted Maynard, my mentor at Paul Weiss. So when I went to Stikeman, I got a lot of referral work from Paul Weiss. So one of my referrals from Ted was Richard Baker and NRDC Equity Partners in 2008, who acquired the Bay. So I represented the acquisition group, NRDC Equity Partners, in their acquisition of Hudson's Bay. And so, again, it just shows the importance of relationships, and in that case, the particular relationship with Ted. Again, that's how my life has gone in a different path because of my relationship with Richard Baker and the team at HBC. So to your question, though, so the type of law that I was practicing was it was strategic advisory work, and the objective of an outside counsel in the context of a corporate transaction is to provide advice, is to outline the risks and the pros and cons of one decision path or another. So I think so going on the business side just was one more step, which was after assessing those, paths and the risks on one side or the other, it was ultimately making the decision. So assessing those risks and then deciding to go path A or path B. So I think I was very well prepared to take that next step because of the history, my history as a corporate lawyer and as an advisor to the business community. And so I think I found it seamless, and I found it exciting, and I felt more, that incremental decision making. I felt more ownership in the ultimate outcome, which was exciting.
And to draw on an earlier theme that you brought up, you're right in the middle of the action.
Right in the middle of the action. Right.
So, yeah.
And in a company, so my role initially was head of corporate development, and so we had acquired, or NRDC Equity Partners had acquired the Bay, Hudson's Bay. Then we did a series of, I don't know, 10, 15 significant transactions over the next, so from 2008 to 2014, at the end of 14, when I joined, I advised on all of those transactions. So I had a deep understanding, which again goes back to why my transition, I think, was relatively seamless. I had a deep understanding, was involved in every conversation in the boardroom and at the C-suite level as it related to the strategic direction of the company since 2008. So I had a familiarity and a comfort level with the team that I was joining, which made it that much easier. And that allowed me to sort of hit the ground running, if you will, and continue doing really what I was doing, but inside, and now sort of being a decision maker.
Yeah. So now you're CEO of Hbc Properties and Investments. Can you tell us what that company does?
Sure. So HBC is more than just the Hudson's Bay business in Canada. So we sort of look at our world as 8 or 10 different portfolio companies. So we have a holding company on top, and we have these operating businesses. So we have Saks Fifth Avenue, brick and mortar in the US. We have Off Fifth, Saks Off Fifth, brick and mortar in the US and Canada. We have Hudson's Bay, brick and mortar in Canada. Then we have 3 digital businesses, which we've separated from the brick and mortar businesses fairly recently. So we have Saks.com, SaksOffFifth.com, and TheBay.com. And then we have a significant portfolio of owned real estate, including the Saks flagship on Fifth Avenue, the Vancouver, Hudson's Bay flagship, Montreal, Calgary. We have an extensive real estate portfolio across the United States and Canada. And we have other businesses. We have an office business. We have a health and wellness business. So my role is, I have a role sort of overseeing on the holdco side those 10 businesses, and I also operate the property and investments business. So the investments business is really the oversight business, and then the properties business is managing our portfolio of real estate.
Just as you were describing those properties, I mean, you've mentioned some of the most iconic commercial
Absolutely.
properties in North America. What is it like to be the steward of those properties? Like, it must come with a certain sense of history and responsibility that's a bit unique.
It is, and it's really, I'm going to say it's fun. It's, these are iconic buildings, and it's fun to understand the potential for these buildings. It's, my history wasn't exclusively real estate, obviously. So I've learned a lot, and I've had a fabulous mentor here to learn a lot about real estate. But these are iconic buildings that are core, at the corner of Main and Main, and sit on top of the subways in many cases. And And it's an interesting role to have a role in the sort of the stewardship of those assets.
I mean, as you were describing it, so I grew up in Montreal.
Yep.
And I remember going to the Bay in Montreal with my mother as a kid, and think about all the millions of people, right, over decades and decades who, have childhood memories in all of these places and who identify with them and treasure them. I mean, that's a very special thing.
Yeah, and our objective, now is to maximize the value of these assets. So, the world has changed. So, do you need an 800,000 square foot department store building in the city center of Montreal today? Probably not. But you need a 200,000 square foot Hudson's Bay Center, which is a significant footprint.
Yeah.
So we're thinking about alternatives to redevelop or introduce alternate uses, or incremental uses is a better word, in that portfolio. Not every asset. There are many assets that we have that are at their highest and best use. So, for example, the flagship on Fifth Avenue, which is 650,000 square feet, it is very productive as a luxury department store, but other locations that we have are ripe for incremental uses in addition to a Hudson's Bay location or a Saks location or otherwise. And that's sort of my focus on the property and investment side.
That's really, really interesting. So you're the first CEO that we've had on the UNB Law Podcast. And I think everyone kind of has I don't know, maybe a stereotypical kind of view of what a CEO does, but most of us are not CEOs. So can you tell us what a CEO does and what your kind of, daily routine is as a CEO of a large company?
So I think the primary role is the management of people and the assessment of risk and decision making. And so, my typical day is engaging with our business leaders and, working with them to make decisions, right? So it's funny, and I want to be careful how I phrase this, but in the practice of law, you often feel like everything rests on your shoulders. So you're giving advice, as you become more senior in the practice of law, the buck stops with you, as they say. And there's a lot of pressure in that. So you're telling a company that, you've done research and you've looked into issues, et cetera, but you're giving advice to a company and you're saying you can do this or you can't do this. And there are big consequences to that advice. And so I always slept well, but it's hard to sleep at night if you've given advice that people are relying on and making decisions. Here, and I think in any healthy work environment, I'm never alone in making a decision. There's a group of us that hold hands and say this is the right path. That's liberating, right? So as the CEO, you have sort of the ultimate say in choosing one path or the other, but you're always there with the team, and you're relying on the advice of your counsel, and you're relying on your professional advisors and the people that are running the businesses that have expertise that you don't have, and it's a liberating feeling. So I do love that aspect of being on the business side, and not to say law firms aren't collaborative, but it's an interesting difference between being a senior practitioner in a law firm and being on the business side in a client. So back to your question, Mike. So a lot of meetings. So a lot of meetings, a lot of reviewing information and working with people to make decisions on one thing or the other. I think by training as a lawyer and having worked in a law firm, again, I've said this before, sort of prepared me well for the role I'm in now. And I think it's, I think I'm a better decision maker. George Bush said the decider in chief. I'm a better decision maker having practiced law and having gone to law school than I would otherwise be, I think.
Can I ask you about decision making, because you probably have to make some tough calls in your job, along with your team. You probably have to make tough calls in the midst of uncertainty, where you might have some advice, but it's only sort of as good as the facts that are known, and sometimes facts change, etc. Or maybe you're kind of breaking sort of a new ground with the direction you're going in, and so things are uncertain. Do you have any sort of principles that you kind of fall back on when you're trying to make those kinds of really tough calls? I'm just curious if you have sort of an approach to those types of decisions.
It's going to sound manufactured, but ultimately you know what the right answer is, right? Not always, but you have in my position, I have the context of what's going on in the entire organization, and I think and having been here, whatever it is now, 9 years, I think I know what's best for the company, I think, and it's not, I'm not always right by any stretch, but you have a good sense of the dynamics, and this is sort of not responsive to your question, but again, because of my training, I think everybody's in the service business. So even the CEO, even the guy I work for, we're all in the service business. We always joke that, I'm responsible for catering and logistics, right? I got to get people to the meeting, and we got to make sure there's food there. So, you always have somebody that you're trying to impress or you're trying to serve, no matter who you are. And I think that's good training from being a service provider in the client service business. And I think it's a skill that not everybody has, but everybody. I tell my kids this: everybody is in the service business, and so you've got to stand out and to be respected and to be successful. You've got to have that mindset of being in the service business, right? What can I do for you? And no matter who you are, I think you got to have that focus. So I sort of think about that in the context of making decisions. I'm in the service business. What's best for the broader group of constituents that I'm trying to manage or appease or deal with?
Right. So you got to think about, who your stakeholders are and
right.
what their priorities are. And yeah, that's good advice. It's actually a really nice segue into our last segment, which is focused on advice for the young lawyer. And one of the questions that we often get asked is how, particularly law students who are, going to work at a big law firm, in New York, Toronto, etc. Sometimes young lawyers find it hard to stand out there or to make their mark, because as you said, there's many first year associates. Paul Weiss has over 100, etc. So what do you think a first year lawyer, let's say at one of these firms, needs to focus on to sort of move their career forward in that environment?
So I guess two things. I'd go back to recognize that you're in the service business, and most importantly, recognize who you're serving, who your client is. So, in many cases, as a first year or second year or fourth year, your client is not, XYZ Corporation. It's the internal team that you're working with. So, my advice would be do your best to impress your client. And know who your client is, obviously. The other big thing I think that I think it differentiated me from not all of my other colleagues, but from others, is my wife describes me as a relentless optimist. So I think that served me well. I think there's a lot of people that are hard driving, hard nosed, pushy people, and that may serve them well. But so know who you are. But to me, I think I know I would always rather work with somebody that's happy-go-lucky, entertaining, and not dour or negative about what they're doing or where they fit within the world or the organization or otherwise. So I think having an optimistic attitude is a way to differentiate yourself. So it's in many of these big firms, it's a tough slog in the first couple of years because you're doing due diligence about a Greek TV company that you have. It's not always the most exciting and engaging work early on, but you got to make the best of it. And I'm not saying you should sacrifice your desire to learn and be, but you got to recognize, certainly in my day, and things may have changed, there is a bit of drudgery in the first couple of years, but you got to be optimistic and you got to be engaged and you got to know who your client is and do the best you can. And these are platitudes, but I think that's how you differentiate yourself. I mean, again, I would much rather work with somebody that's got a great attitude and is optimistic rather than somebody that comes in and says, "Oh, I got to do that again," or "I got to," I think you got to look at the world in a as a glass half full kind of thing, kind of perspective. And I think people will be, that do that are going to be ultimately more successful because people will want to engage with them. People will want to mentor them. People will want to, to help them out along the way and bring them into meetings. And so I think it's an important part of starting off as a practicing lawyer.
Ian, that's fantastic advice. Absolutely fantastic. Because, as you say, the work is hard enough, right, for everyone, not just the juniors, but the partners are also, under pressure. So they want to surround themselves with good people that make them feel happy, in their working lives, right? And I just, it's a simple thing, but it's amazing how often lawyers lose track of that.
And I think people know the type of person you are in a second, right? I mean, it's maybe not a second, but people form first impressions, and those first impressions are lasting. So you obviously want to have a good first impression. But again, back to my experience at UNB, there was nobody. I had friends that went to U of T or different law schools, and there was nobody ripping cases out of books so nobody else could look at them. I mean, that doesn't happen anymore because everything's on the internet. But being a good classmate is so important. I mean, it doesn't hurt you to help somebody else, or again, people want to engage with people that are helpful and friendly and optimistic. And I think people should not look at the world as I need to get ahead, and that means that somebody else needs to fall behind. I just don't think the world operates that way anymore, if it ever did.
Yeah, no, as I say, that's fantastic advice. One of the things that I've heard from some other business leaders is they've said to me that lawyers often complicate things, that they complicate transactions needlessly. And this is sort of in the context of my discussions about where we're taking the law school. So I've heard, well, our lawyers always complicate things. You need to get your law graduates to be more creative and to be more flexible. I'm curious what you think about that assessment. Like, do you think it's true that lawyers have a tendency to complicate things, and what impact do you think legal education has on that sort of mindset if it exists?
So defending the practice, things are complicated, right? So it's if everything was straightforward and easy, then you frankly wouldn't need lawyers involved. So and everything we Hudson's Bay Company has ever done has been complicated. So I think it's and I may have said this before, but I think it's the role of the outside lawyer to provide advice and to provide an assessment of risks related to various alternatives. One thing I will say, and I know the importance of legal writing, and and maybe it's different for litigators, but I'm a big fan of the bullet point. So unless you can say something in 4 bullet points, it's not worth saying. So I do think that the world is complicated. Transactions are complicated, but the best, or one of the best strengths a lawyer can have when advising a client is to simplify that complication. So again, when I was a practicing lawyer, I recall an incident in 2008, probably in connection with the Hudson's Bay transaction. In fact, it was. So we were advising a New York private equity firm, and a question about the Investment Canada Act came up. I got a long, complicated answer about whether it was applicable or not, and you can't send that to a client, a 3-page memo on the applicability of the competition or the Investment Canada Act. So you have to distill it, and you have to conclude. So you have to say you can or cannot do this, and you got to provide the risks, or outline the risks. But you can't just send them a treatise on the Investment Canada Act and how it may or may not be applicable in the context. So I think lawyers get a bad name occasionally because they don't go that extra step and take that quote risk and make a conclusion, which I think you have to do. And again, there's a lot of weight on your shoulder as the ultimate person that's delivering that advice. But I think that's the role, right? You have to educate, but you have to conclude and assess that risk.
And how does a lawyer acquire that mindset? I mean, is it something that comes from good mentorship, or just kind of years of experience? How do you get to that point where you're able to look at a complex problem, distill it to its essential parts, and then have the confidence to make a precise recommendation? How does a lawyer develop that kind of skill set?
It's definitely through doing it, right? So I would not have had that confidence, and frankly, I wasn't always confident. But if you're not confident, you still have to give an answer, but you have to say you're not confident, or as confident as you might otherwise be. But I think it comes with experience, but it also comes with knowing your audience, and you have to understand what your client's objectives are, and you have to have a relationship with the decision maker at your client where you feel comfortable, and you need to be honest and upfront with them about the risks. But you got to take a position, I think, and you got to caveat that position however you can. But people want answers; they don't want uncertainty. And as long as they recognize that there is some risk in the position you're taking, then you've done your job. But you have to sort of get there.
Okay. One of the things about lawyers and law students, is they like to try to plan everything out, and so I sometimes talk to our first year students, and they've decided their next 10 years is going to be a certain way, right? But life often doesn't work out that way, and you got to sort of shift to take advantage of opportunities or to bounce back from setbacks. And I'm wondering if you have any advice in that regard, and how you kind of roll with the punches a little bit, either because you're presented with an opportunity that you hadn't contemplated, or that maybe things didn't work out for you, and you have to shift your priorities.
Right. So it's a good point on sort of rolling with the punches, being flexible, and not knowing what's going to happen. So when Betsy and I moved back to Toronto to have a family and raise that family in Toronto, we thought we would be there forever. And in 2014, the opportunity came along to now that we had 3 boys, young boys, we're moving back to New York. And we obviously debated that as a family, but your life is not linear, and you got to make decisions along the way. Sometimes you'll make good decisions, sometimes you'll make bad decisions, but you gotta, again, it's all about assessing risk and deciding what you want to do, what path you want to take. So definitely, I think you have to have an open mind as to where your career and life will take you. I think an education, a legal education, gives you those, some tools that that others don't have in terms of assessing alternatives. Um, but not everything works out. But you gotta make the best of your situation. Again, back to the relentless optimism. Uh, you know, don't decide to do something and then 3 months later, put your head down and kick the sand because you think you made the wrong decision. Um, uh, Make the best of it, and nothing is permanent, right? So if you take a job somewhere, if you do something that's not what you thought you'd be doing at this point in your life, you can always come back. You can always pivot. You can, people think that decisions are permanent, and they're not. And uh, I think today's, class, young lawyers have a whole different set of issues than certainly I had when I joined the profession. And it's probably a lot more difficult now because, the whole work from home thing and it's hard to learn as a young lawyer if there's no mentorship, and you can't have a Zoom or digital relationship with people. So you got to make the best of the situation, though. So I think, having a positive attitude, recognizing that, there will be bumps in the road, and make the best of what you can, what you got. And again, know that, I think having a UNB legal education sets you up well to do a variety of different things and take advantage of what you want to do.
Well, a little bit related to that, there's a lot of talk in legal education and legal profession about promoting resilience. So the idea that, lawyers need to be able to cope with adversity because, we're charged with, representing the interests of other people. And so we've got to make sure that we're in control of our emotions and exercising good judgment and fit to discharge our obligations. And so there's a fair bit of focus on that now in the field and what we can do to promote resilience. I mean, do you have any sort of thoughts on this, or maybe in particular how you cope with stress or adversity that arises in your life? Like, do you have any advice in that regard? Because it's not always just the sort of technical skills and substantive knowledge, but it's also about trying to keep our emotions in check so we can do our jobs.
So again, the again, life is complicated. There's lots going on. You've got, we have 3 boys that are dragging us in different directions, and we've got, jobs that are, require us to be focused and pay attention. And there's a lot of stress with decision making. And so I think, you can't second guess your decision once you've made it. If you realize you were wrong, then you should pivot. But don't stew about a decision you've made if you're driving down a certain road. So don't wake up at night thinking, oh, I probably should have gone through door B, not door A. If you've made the decision and it's not patently incorrect, then stick with it. The other thing is diffuse the risk, if you will. So bring people along. I think, again, it's so much healthier for one's life to make decisions with others, right? To hold hands and say, this is the path we're going to take. So you're not bearing the responsibility on your own. I'm not trying to flout individual responsibility, but it's so much healthier to bring people along and to collectively make a decision to the extent that you're in a position to be able to do that. So and that makes you know, we've made some bad decisions, or I've made some bad decisions ultimately, but making them together is so much better than being, thinking you're the nail that's sticking up, that took this or made this decision or chose this path on your own. And so bring people involved, bring people in.
That's great advice. You mentioned a little bit that maybe things are harder for young lawyers these days, and a lot of the sort of the labor market and the legal profession is cyclical. So there are ups and downs. If we're kind of in a maybe uncertain period, or if there's a down period on the horizon, do you have any advice for young lawyers in entering an environment like that? What sorts of things do they need to do to sort of make it in that context?
So it's funny. I was talking to a friend of mine who's a partner at Paul Weiss in August, and it's I think the expectation of a new first year lawyer in terms of their overall career trajectory is significantly different than when I was a first year lawyer. I think, without exception, in my class of 16 articling students, everyone wanted to be a partner at Stikeman Elliott at the right time. I don't think that's the case anymore, and I think that's a good thing. I think it means that the law firms need to adapt and to figure out how to work better with people that have ultimately different objectives, but that are real value add to the firm. So again, that's not an answer to your question, but I think the world is a little different today than when I was starting off in my career, which I think is an important difference. So I think the student's expectation of where they're going with their career and what it means is different. Saying that, I think if you do want to be if you do want to have a career in law, and you decide that you want a Bay Street environment, then I think you got to play that game. I think you got to understand where you are and understand what your objective is. And if your objective is to be a partner at Stikeman Elliott, then I think you got to show up. You got to be engaged. You got to find a mentor. You got to have that positive attitude, the can-do attitude, and you got to do your best. And I think that's hard in a Zoom world. I think hopefully people are back in the office. I'm in the office today. Hopefully people are back in the office soon, because that personal interaction is critical. So I guess my advice would be, find out what you want to do, recognize it's not a permanent commitment, and you can always pivot to doing something different. But make the best of what you're trying to do. The other thing I would say is a big law is not always the answer. And if you do have an interest in corporate law, but it's a difficult job market, there are government opportunities that should be explored. So one thing that always struck me is that the back and forth between private practice in the United States and government, and significant high-end private practice and government, is significant. Is there's a lot of it. There's people that are partners at Paul Weiss or partners at big New York law firms that second themselves to the government for a few years at all levels, right? So we don't see that as much in Canada, which always sort of I always thought was it was a bad thing that we didn't see that back and forth to government, and firms didn't facilitate that back and forth. So to be the chairman of the Alberta Securities Commission for a few years and then go back to private practice, that's a good thing. And so my point being, if there's a difficult environment in private practice, then explore government options, which I think you can then leverage and use as a stepping stone to a private practice. And again, that's just those are just my thoughts.
Yeah, well, actually, you mentioned earlier Lawson Hunter is
exactly.
an example of that. One of our guests here in the next couple of weeks will be Mark Jewett, who had a career for 30 years in the public service. Now is counsel at Bennett Jones, but he was general counsel of the Bank of Canada, and all sorts of big positions in government. And so you can. I agree. You can move between public and private practice. These aren't mutually exclusive. My last question, though, I just want to pick up on something that you mentioned that maybe law firms or legal employers might need to change the way they do things to adapt to current expectations. Do you have any ideas of how they need to adapt, or what sorts of things they need to do differently?
So I haven't, again, having not been in a law firm environment for a number of years now, this is just going to be anecdotal, my own view of things. I think they have to be more flexible, right? So I think in order to attract the top talent that might have a very different career trajectory or expectation than I did, I think law firms have to be flexible. So I think, and I think that's what you're going to see. I think in order to attract top talent, law firms will be flexible, and I think that's a good thing. And again, just back to the, I think law firms need to be more open to the whole process is kind of absurd, right? You got to, everybody applies for articles, and they become first year, second year, third. They have to be more open to bringing in people at different levels, right? Mm-hmm. So to the conversation we just have, if you start off at the Attorney General's office and you work there for 3 years, any law firm should be delighted to have that person with that experience come in, but they don't make it easy. There's obviously lateral hiring, but my sense would be, and this may be unfair, but those laterals are often, they're up. There's a challenge because they have to integrate, and the firms don't make it easy, and there's a group of people already that are moving up the chain. I think law firms have to be more flexible and broader in how they look at recruiting and who they're recruiting, and provide smart people with a different way to work.
Because it seems like the whole structure of talent recruitment and retention in the law firms is built around sort of the law school pipeline,
Yes.
And
yes.
So you get them in the OCIs and then the interns and then and there's so much time and resources spent on that there can't be very much left over for what you're talking about, that flexibility.
Right.
Yeah. So maybe
I think that has to change. I think that has to change because you're going to not, again, my perspective is that people in law school today, again, I'm not generalizing, but they have different expectations. And I think if you want to recruit that talent, you've got to understand what those expectations. Not everybody wants to be a partner on Bay Street. Not everybody wants to be a partner at a law firm. So you got to be flexible in recruiting that talent, sort of up the chain, if you will, and being flexible on their commitment and how they work.
Well, that's a great note to end on. I could talk to you forever, Ian, but we've come to the end of our time. I really appreciate you being a guest on the UNB Law Podcast. I also want to thank our audience for listening, and stay tuned for more episodes featuring remarkable people who are part of our UNB Law community. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks, Mike. Just to say it, again, back to relationships and back to sort of career paths and life paths. I strongly believe that my time at UNB, set me on the path that I took, obviously, and it could not have been a better foundation for where my life took me and where I am today.
Wow. Well, that's an amazing endorsement, and Ian, we're really proud of all your accomplishments as well, and to call you a UNB Law alumnus. I know that your professors and our students and your classmates are going to be really interested in hearing where your career has taken you and your life has taken you since UNB Law. You're a great role model for our community, and really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us.
Thanks so much.
All right.